Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Consistent Creators. This is a show where I sit down with inspiring creators to learn from their journeys. I'm your host, Darshan, and today I'm sitting down with Louis. Louis is a friend of mine. We know each other, I think, for 3 or 4 years now, or even more than that. Louis currently works as a design advocate at Figma. We all know him from the content that he has been producing on Twitter and different blogs and live streams and podcasts and whatnot. I don't know how much time this man has. Louis is also an avid side projector. He has this habit, just like me, of starting a lot of side projects simultaneously. I like that. It keeps you sharp. And I think the first time that I met Louis was 4 or 5 years back when Louis had started a podcast called Noise FM. And he had invited me as a guest on that. And today I'm returning the favor. I hope I've done a decent job of introducing you, Louis, but I would just like to hear from you. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Darshan. Nice to see you again virtually. We've met officially in person a few months ago, which was a unique experience. I'm Louis, designer advocate at Figma. Sometimes I think you might have said design advocate. Some people say design advocate. It is actually designer advocate, which is a very small but important difference. And the difference is that we advocate mostly for the people that are designers rather than design their profession. And that small difference means that we pay attention a lot more to community. So what that job is along the lines of, well, firstly, you're a designer, or you have been a designer for a number of years in the industry. So you have that experience. We then use that experience to do a number of things. So I mentioned the community bit before, and that is, again, quite an abstract word, which doesn't necessarily mean very much without explanation. So community for us is everybody using Figma. Everybody who uses Figma is part of that community. That focuses itself sometimes on places like Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, those social platforms. But then more broadly, the community hangs out in person and online in events. And basically any touch point that is not in the software is where the community lives. So a big part of the job is listening to, speaking to, hanging out with, learning from, and educating the community. Then there is a large part of the job where we work internally with the sales and account management team, supporting them with basically the community, but in a sales aspect. So sitting in on customer sessions, running demos, running workshops, and educating companies rather than individuals. And that takes up about another third of the job. And within that, it is a little bit more nuanced as well, in that we typically work with larger design teams. So I personally focus a lot of my energy on design teams of sort of 50 plus designers, and more specifically their design system efforts. So I spend a lot of time really nerding out with large teams about components, auto layout, libraries, styles, all that sort of stuff. Then there's the part of the job which is around like the product. So being a product, and this is in quotes, expert is really important. Somebody who is deeply passionate about the product and generally the software itself. We've all probably had our software journey in our career, and we are now in the Figma land and Figma ecosystem. And we have all been really passionate users of that product, which is kind of one of the reasons we got the job. Another aspect is content. So that's kind of what we're probably going to be speaking a lot about today. And then there's sort of a buffer of anything else. So the thing we're doing right now, this conversation, sits inside that buffer of engagements within the community itself. That's some of the things that I get to do inside the job. I've been speaking for a while.
Oh, that's a lot to tackle. I think you already answered some of the things that I wanted to ask you, which is about explaining the design advocate job or designer advocate job. We are going to learn about the difference today. It's relatively newer. It's not something that everybody knows about. Developer advocates have been in the field for some time, and I guess designer advocate is something that we picked from developer advocates. I would like to know a little bit more about what are the things that you're doing internally, because we already see a lot of the things that you do externally. You already mentioned that creating this content pieces and explaining how the product works and live streams and offline events. You also mentioned how you're collaborating with the team inside Figma, but could you clarify or could you list down some of the activities that you do on a day-to-day basis while working with them? One of them you mentioned that you are part of demos. So when sales teams they're doing demos with enterprise customers, I would say you would then be like a solutions architect. I think that's how a lot of people define it. But what are the other things that you're doing with the product teams or design teams internally? How are you helping them in their role?
Sure. I think the distinction you made, or the comparison, I guess, from developer advocacy and design advocacy or designer advocacy is a good one. When I first joined 2.5 years ago, I'm pretty sure nobody knew what my job title meant. And it's still quite hard to understand. I think it's more of an American terminology. Evangelism is more of the European word for what we do. But again, that sounds a little bit spiritual. So it's probably not that appropriate unless design is your spiritual guide, I guess. But yeah, the distinction or comparison is quite useful there. Internally, where do I start? We, or I particularly, I spend a lot of time annoying the design and product teams. So I'm constantly in every single Slack thread, every single Slack channel that we have on a feature level. So we have Slack channels for each individual feature that is getting built, providing feedback, taking community sentiment, passing it on to the right people, logging feature requests or bugs or ideas in our Asana boards. Then that's sort of like the scrappy side, I suppose, of taking the feedback from the community, pushing it internally. On a more regular basis, I guess, there is frequent meeting sessions for these new features that are coming up. There's actually one tomorrow about a feature that I now realize I can't tell you, but is going to be a big one, where the advocacy team is going to be speaking with the product manager of that feature to learn about it in depth, understand the roadmap, internally meeting sessions, planning, roadmaps, all that sort of stuff. We're currently going through the 2023 planning for the advocate up to community, up to marketing team. So as you can imagine, there's tons of things that will be going on throughout those different disciplines that we contribute to, but also want to drive ourselves. Ultimately, advocacy is quite a hard thing to give specific targets to, because you feed into, as I mentioned earlier, basically every other team. Marketing, product, sales, support, you're touching all those different bases. So as long as those teams are being successful, we're kind of being successful too.
Wow. You are involved in so many things, internally and externally both. I just cannot imagine how are you not going insane with all of the amount of notifications that you're getting. People are constantly tagging you everywhere, right?
The Slack notification bashing is very real, and is probably one of the goals for this year to tame that. I personally, on Monday, so yesterday, I left about 20 Slack channels that I was part of, and I still have probably 100 that I'm in, just because I personally am deeply interested in everything that's going on. I think it's important for me to be interested and passionate about all the aspects of the business that's happening. But there, as you said, the reality of that is quite challenging for time management. I probably spend 30, 60 minutes a day reading updates on features and plans and all that sort of thing.
What is the expectation on you? Do they expect you to be a part of all of the internal communication that's happening on Slack? And if anyone is asking questions on social media, is it the expectation on you to always be a part of all those things?
Not necessarily. There's sort of an inherent trust in us to trust our gut on what these things mean and the impact that they can have. We generally have a policy that we wouldn't necessarily reply to things like that we'd see externally, but we might pass them on to somebody internally. The challenge, not just for us, but I guess anybody on social media, is as soon as you engage in negative sentiment, you're opening a can of worms. And our policy really is, let's treat that as something we'd handle internally rather than shoot from the hip and reply to something that you might regret later on. So there's no expectation on us to get involved in all of these things, but we are really interested in doing so, just because we want the product to be better, the business to be better, and for everybody using Figma to have a better experience.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I just wanted to touch a little bit on like what the exciting parts of the job are. Now, I'm just trying to understand here, because this role is relatively new, as we spoke about it earlier. There are a lot of people who might be exploring, they might be just thinking of designer advocate role, whether it's for them or not, and they might have very obvious questions like, what is it that really excites you? Because I imagine this role is quite different from the regular designer role. And if you're really passionate about working as an individual contributor, you might not want to let go of a lot of things that you enjoy. So what is something that's very exciting for you about this role?
Yeah, the funny thing about this is that what I find really exciting about the role is probably really scary to other people. And that's, I think, really important to distinguish when you're thinking about advocacy generally, not just advocacy at Figma, but advocacy as a job itself. So things that I personally find, probably to no surprise to you, is that I get to do speaking, I get to write, I get to educate, I get to mentor, I get to advise, and then I also get this opportunity to almost lead an industry in thought leadership material. So those things are, for me, basically checking every box of, firstly, my skill set, but also my interests. Whereas somebody who is not necessarily a confident speaker, writer, educator, resource creator, that would probably be the worst job in the world for them. So that's where I think it's important to know that this is ultimately an outward facing position, and you need to be comfortable with that, which is not necessarily everybody's natural skill set. Not that you can't learn it, but it's not necessarily everybody's natural skill set.
Yeah, and have you always been passionate about things like this? You can also say that people who are outgoing or who are extroverted, they might like this kind of things. So have you always been this kind of person? Because I think when there's also a distinction over here. When we say that your job requires you to do writing and public speaking and a lot of outward facing events. Now, I'm also someone who enjoys that. I do that from time to time. I think I write every day. There are different outlets through which I write, and speaking is also a part of it. But I can't really see myself doing this day in and day out, because there's a certain point at which my battery runs out. I would enjoy this for a certain time. And there's something that I actively like to practice and I like to get better at, because I think it's very important for you to develop as a well-rounded person. But it's not something that I can continue doing all day round. But you seem to enjoy it. So have you been a person like this always?
I don't know, honestly. I have always been, if I remember back to school, the person who, I remember there was a project in primary school where we were using Microsoft Publisher to design a magazine cover or something. I was deeply interested in learning that tool inside out, and then trying to be the person who would answer questions about it to my peers. So I think that has always been something I wanted to do and naturally gravitate to. If I think about university, we were being taught Flash and ActionScript to make animated games. And I tried to become the person in the class who knew all the error codes of ActionScript. So that, and this isn't one goal that I had. It just naturally happened because I was just spending 12 hours a day doing it. So when we were in a session with the rest of the course mates, and they said, my animation keyframe is broken on this level and I don't know what's working. And I would think, oh yeah, I experienced that. This was the code that was the problem. I Googled it. This was the answer. Here's the answer for you. So I'd naturally gravitate towards finding out answers to common problems. And now I kind of do that every day. On the battery running out point, you're absolutely right. That does happen, and it is and can be exhausting to be almost in the spotlight all the time, but you don't. The reality is it's not all the time, and we would become exhausted if you treat it like a constant song and dance. The way that I look at it is that it's kind of like to switch on, which means maybe I'm not that extroverted. So I kind of switch on the outgoing, vocal, eloquent side of my personality when I need to do that. If you see me working though, I don't talk to anybody. I sit in the corner and I put my head down, got my headphones on, and I'm just working hours on end. And then if I need to go on stage, I can just kind of do that. So over time, I've developed, I guess, this split personality.
Well, I think you're doing it right. I mean, as long as you're able to control it, I think that's the key. Can you think of a time when your battery actually ran out and you got exhausted and you were not looking forward to your next speaking gig?
Oh, for sure. The end of last year, I was sick a lot. I think I had 2 separate entire weeks off work because I was just run down to the ground. And that's because firstly, last year was just really intense. But secondly, I have a problem with saying no. So I would always say yes to these things to do and just pile them up on top of each other and then realize, oh yeah, in an hour, I need to go and present this event somewhere. And that's just not, I wouldn't advise people to firstly just say yes to everything. But I also wouldn't advise for you to say yes to things outside of your capacity. That's the whole point of having a team, is that you can delegate these things to other people or ask if anybody would like to do the events that you're doing. So yes, it definitely happened. And yeah, the end of last year, I was run down. It was the end of a really long, tough, grueling year. I think last year I hosted 2 conferences and did a bunch of other events, and that's sort of on top of the day job, which can be really tough and tiring, but I did it and I learned lots of lessons. And the lesson really is to take pride over your time and say no to things that you don't need to be doing.
How did you bounce back from that time? Because it's very important that once you're back, once you've taken some time off, you also feel excited about the same thing, because it's not like all of a sudden your job is going to change. Mm-hmm. Something that got you exhausted, it's still a part of your job now. Now, how do you get excited about it again?
Yeah, the bind really is that I love this. I love doing what I do. And the interest to come back after being very tired is that I'm really interested to keep going. I have so many ideas I want to do, and I want to execute these ideas as much as possible, as fast as possible still, even though that might ultimately make me exhausted and burn me out. The reason why I want to go back and do anything, this is kind of probably loosely linking to the general idea about side projects and the culture that you're talking about, is, do you still want to do it? If the answer is yes, you will continue. If the answer is no, then give it up. That's why I think that prioritizing your time and the events that you do is exceptionally important to maintaining that interest.
Yeah, I think it's a clear sign that you really enjoy what you do, because it's easier to be motivated by extrinsic factors. Because, when you look at a role like this, from the outside, it looks quite glamorous. You're traveling and meeting people, and people start to recognize you, and you almost start feeling like a celebrity. But that also wears off after a certain point of time. The extrinsic motivation wouldn't last long. And when you have been in the stage where you got burnt out by that, and if you're able to recover from that and still be excited about doing the same thing, I think that's like a clear sign that you are enjoying what you're doing and you are in the right place.
Yeah, but really importantly, I don't do this for people to see me. I do it because there's a real desperate lack of shared knowledge generally in the industry. And people typically just try and charge you a lot of money for knowledge, which I think should be a given. Obviously, I get paid to do my job, so there's kind of a bind in that way. But I don't do this to get more followers or to be recognized. I do it because I really want to educate people and have an excellent platform in Figma to do that.
Right. And since you have talked about followers and personal brand, there's just one thing that I would like to touch upon over there. How important do you think brand name is to grow your personal audience? Because I've seen your journey for some time now. When we were talking earlier, I think the quality of the content that you were creating, I don't think it has changed a lot. You were all really good. I still remember one of these articles I saw, like how you had set up the file structure inside Figma and how you had started building the design system at the company that you were at. When I started out at HighGraph and I wanted to build a system, your article was really helpful to me over there. And based on that, I created a system internally, which became very useful to the company. And on the back of that, I also wrote a thread and then I wrote an article. Now, it is something that I keep on referring to all the time. And based on that, I've also created a framework. I've taught modules. So that just one system or one framework that I've applied, I have created so many different avenues from that. And credit where credit is due. Like your article was very useful to me to come up with that structure. So the point that I'm making over here is your quality was always there, but you did not have the following back then. Now, when I look at your Twitter, you obviously gain a lot of traction. So the question is that how important do you think that brand name is to build your personal brand?
I'm probably going to split this up into a bunch of different questions as I think through it live. Just to talk about the point of quality, there's a very easy assumption to be made if somebody hears you say that, to think that the work I've done has always just been good. And firstly, I would contest that. I'd contest my quality. I'd say it's not that good. But the fact is that I have a lot of experience. I've been employed as a designer for over 10 years and working in different industries, different teams, different structures to build up that knowledge base. So it probably comes down to the phenomenon of sort of overnight success. And that I just don't think that's true. I think people work on themselves over many years and then they appear in your timeline and you're like, well, where did this come from? And it's like, well, I have this backlog of information and experience and expertise that I've been building on slowly but surely. Specifically on the article stuff, because I got back into article writing in 2017. And that's a long time ago. And it wasn't for the article that you specifically mentioned. I think I wrote that 2 years after that. So that is 2 years worth of experience writing articles to understand the format, length, structure, what people want to hear, how to promote it, how to give it a good title, what assets to put inside there. All that experimentation happened before. So it didn't just land. This is where I'm building up this case of if you feel like you can't really do it, then you definitely can. You just need to practice. Back to the actual question though of personal brand. Now I've had the chance to think about it. I am probably in a unique position in that I have a company brand which is so loved and strong that I'm sitting on top of effectively. So I'd say that, do I need a personal brand? Pre-Figma, yes. In Figma, no, because Figma is the brand that I'm riding the wave of, and I'm very fortunate to do that. That's also where the exposure comes from. Let's maybe talk about a non-Figma use case and talk about the things I've tried, the projects I've started and tried. When I was at university, I started a WordPress blog called The Conjecture. And that was an attempt to build a interview base, wrote interview creatives and ask them the same 5 questions every time. That might sound familiar. I'll come back to that in a second. And this was in 2010, I think. Yeah, so a long time ago. And I struggled to get traction because I didn't have anybody to talk to, anybody to interview. So that's a very important point too. So that side project died. Then I started my personal newsletter in 2015. Again, a long time ago. All this practice is really important. That has its own sub-brand. I don't even promote it very much. It's just kind of sitting there. And I attempt to write a newsletter every Sunday. I've been very lazy recently, but that's the goal. So that's 7 years old. Then in 2017, the article you mentioned sort of came around this time when I started a new sub-brand called 8pixel, 8px. And that was an attempt to basically build a house around all the content that I was producing or wanted to produce. At that time, it was mostly articles, but I had these goals of UI kits and component libraries and podcast and articles and do my freelance work through that brand name too. That still loosely is happening. I did launch a podcast through 8pixel, and I used the format from the Conjecture a decade before, where I asked people the same 5 questions every time. Some of the articles in that 8pixel project too, there used to be, I've sort of abandoned this idea, so as a side project within a side project, there was an article series where I'd ask people the same 5 questions every month. Again, similar format, and this is where you sort of scratch the surface of these ideas and see what works in different formats, different places, and most importantly, different times. Something that didn't work in 2010 worked really well in 2020 or 2021. So just because something doesn't work at that moment, it might work later on. For somebody who is looking to start producing articles or a component library or illustrations or whatever, I would focus on the content. The brand is a distraction. Trust me when I say that, because you can spend a week, 2 weeks, 6 months thinking up a logo, a name, building a custom website, building a color theme, marketing banners, Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts, LinkedIn profiles for this project that doesn't even have anything yet. The brand for me is always a second thing you need to be worried about, and it comes much later. Once you have the content, once you have the things you've produced, then wrap a brand around it, because then there's probably people paying attention. If they're not paying attention, that's also fine. But if you just want to house your things in one place, build the brand second.
Yeah, I love that approach. It's also something that I try to do with my own projects. You mentioned a very interesting thing over there, which is about riding this wave of Figma, because Figma has such a strong brand, and you as a part of your job are required to create content for Figma. You naturally also benefit from that. For people who are not essentially working with the brand, but they're also trying to produce educational content and they're also trying to build personal brand, I see that they could also take 2 approaches. So one is that they could talk about fundamental topics, about some fundamentals of design. And then there's also another thing about creating content related to a brand. So it's about tutorials or way that you worked with a particular product or a tool, and then you figured out a way to make it better. You created plugins. But then there's just one issue with that, which is you then also become dependent upon the brand, similar to how you have rented platforms. When you create content on rented platforms, you have the dependency on the rented platform. And the other thing is, when you create content which is directly related to a particular product, then you also have a dependency on that product. Yeah. Now, what is the approach that you would suggest that people who are looking to create educational content and people who are looking to grow a personal brand, what would you suggest them to do? Create content for the particular product or create content on fundamentals?
I would create content for yourself. So whatever you think you didn't know before, you now know it. Educate yourself on that. As an example, you can take either approach. Somebody who is a designer who recently learned about the 8-point grid system, for example, produce material that explains that concept in the best way that you would find interesting and understanding, and you'd understand it. So just like a lot of startups start with somebody building a problem or product for themselves, create content for yourself, and then see where that goes. The most important thing is the consistency, and that's your favorite thing, consistency and delivering it at scale, because one video, one article is not a brand. Over time and over a series of executed examples, you can start to find your voice and find what you find interesting to talk about. If you want to get followers, if that's your goal, piggybacking a brand is probably the best way to do that. There are some very popular Notion template builders on YouTube and other platforms who have built successful businesses actually from creating Notion templates and examples. If that's what you find interesting, go and do that. But that's also not what a lot of people would find interesting. So I would look internally first. What do I enjoy doing? What do I enjoy talking about? And how can I digest that into smaller pieces of information for other people?
Yeah, Louis, I think you really answered this in the best way. It was almost like this question was scripted for you and you already had the answer in your head because, well, this is also the approach that I would preach. And I just do this. And like, you don't really have to care much about this kind of things if you're just creating something which is useful to you. And as a byproduct of that, there are millions of people, billions of people on the internet who are also looking for solutions like that, who are struggling with the same kind of problems, and they naturally find your solution useful. Well, I'm glad that you actually answered it that way.
The probably unspoken part of all of this is that if you want to create things that people will see, you kind of need to be a marketer as well. You need to be able to market your own content. And I don't mean advertising budgets and that sort of marketing. I mean writing an article with a subject line or a title that people are going to find and search for. How can you craft something that people are actually going to find in a Figma community, YouTube, medium.com, Substack, whatever? And that's probably the thing you want to be thinking about. It's not writing 100,000 words on the 8-point grid system. It's the 8-point grid system in a simple way, or whatever your title is, that enables people to then go and find it. On the personal brand stuff as well, just something that I'll definitely forget to say if I don't say it now, but I see so many examples of people's personal brand being a distraction from their goals. And the goal usually is to get a job or to get known or to get some kind of engagement. But I will always see Twitter profiles where it's not a real photo as the avatar. Your bio is empty. You don't have your name on there, or you might have something that's inappropriate as a picture, background image, or a description. You don't have a link out to a website or to whatever content you're creating. I think in the first instance, when you're applying for a job, people are always going to try and find your social profile. And if they find it and they see that it's not filled out, or it may be slightly inappropriate, that's not a good look. So I just recommend everybody to fine tune their profile, put your name on there, put your picture on there, put a description that is easy to read on there as well. So it looks effectively like a resume extension. If you think about my Twitter handle of Disco Lou, I created that on a whim, just off the cuff. And it's a pun on the Simpsons character Disco Stew, in case you're not a Simpsons fan. But I find that being lighthearted in these kind of things is actually quite important, just because it becomes memorable, to the point where some people have called me Disco in the past as my name. I think that's just a reflection on the approach to that personal branding that you mentioned. I didn't spend weeks coming up with that. It didn't form part of a project, a case study, or anything like that. It was just something that came to mind and has worked in the long run because it's recognizable and memorable.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. It's very important to make the differentiation, because when you call it a personal brand, it's not exactly like a company. I think with a company, you would want to, when a company gets of a certain size, you would want to pay people to come up with names where it means something and it represents their brand well, because there are so many things that are tied with it. But in case of your personal brand, there's a reason that it's called a personal brand. It's about you. There needs to be a part of your personality in it. And it's just something that you create, and then it automatically takes a shape and form, and people slowly start associating you with it. So I think that's a great way to go about it and not complicating it too much. I've seen a lot of people when they get stuck in this mindset of creating something perfect, or they really want a strong personality, and then they would spend months or even years, or some people, they wouldn't even start. They would just be like looking for that right name, right brand color, right image, right avatar. It just doesn't matter, right?
Correct. Just do it. Just get something out there. You can always change it. You can always change your Twitter handle or your website URL. You can always change those things. So focus on the content first. And as I said, the brand is kind of secondary to that at the start.
Yeah, perfect. Let's also try and do something interesting. I would want to get an idea about how you come up with ideas. So,
Mhm.
because you have been producing so much content, and I'm not sure if it's a part of your job that you're supposed to create a certain number of threads and certain number of articles every month.
I've just clarified that it's not.
Okay, awesome. But when you're creating a lot of these articles and threads, how are you coming up with those ideas? What does the process look like?
If I'm being completely honest, it's basically whatever is in my brain at 2 p.m. that day, and I'll very quickly hash something together in thread form.
That's a very specific time that you mentioned. Why 2 p.m.?
That is because it is the morning for the US and it's the afternoon for Europe. And you can also sometimes get the evening for Australia and New Zealand.
Right. So you want most of the people to see what you create.
Correct. Yeah. That's through a lot of trial and error just to see when most people are active. And that is generally the best time I've found for my kind of stuff. Some people might find that it's the morning for them or other times, but generally I try and produce something that is pushed out at that time every single day. Again, the consistency word is important here.
Yeah, but does that mean that you are creating it and posting it in real time? So
Yes.
you're not really waiting on it, iterating or making it better, trying to spend some time, cutting all the corners. You're not doing any of that?
Well, like I said earlier, this is coming from experience. So and yes, I do create it live a lot of the time, and I'm thinking and producing and posting at the same time. And the reason I think that's important is because I'm actually executing and delivering. I'm not putting it into a backlog, planning it and delaying it and then abandoning it and then coming back 6 months later, forgetting what it was that I wanted to talk about. It's reactive and it's appropriate for that moment. In saying that, because I'm doing this all the time, these ideas are just in the back of my brain. So it's kind of like pulling out from a drawer of ideas that are just somewhere floating around. And tomorrow might be the day for this idea that just comes to mind at that moment. So
do you have a dump of those ideas somewhere? Like you can come up with these ideas in any situation, right? Could be a situation where it's inappropriate to actually take notes or to sit down and actually write that thread or article. So when you're coming with these ideas, do you have a place where you're storing them on fly?
Kind of. My Figma desktop app is 20 tabs at any moment of potential ideas as well. So these things might just be dropped into a file and then left. So I said it's all live and reactive. It kind of is, but it's also kind of not. In that, if we take an example of a thread I did the other day on responsive handoff files for a freelance project that I did, that idea came whilst I was doing that freelance project. I didn't post it for 3 weeks because it was just bubbling away in my brain as to wait and to see the format that I thought was appropriate for that content. Then when I actually posted it, I was creating those tweets and the assets live. But I knew at that moment, everything had organized itself inside my brain to the point where it was ready to be pushed. I say just in air quotes, just had to write the tweets, which in itself is a challenge to fit into the format and the size. But most of the time it is something that I thought about either as a reactive thing to something that's happened that day, to a question that's come in from somebody recently, or something I've actually done and found that there is an opportunity to produce some lengthy content on that concept. I'm generally trying to polish a little bit more the asset quality now at the moment. So if you'd asked me this question a year ago, it would have been, I'm making the asset, publishing it 30 seconds later. That quality then dips a bit, as you can imagine. So I'm trying to prepare things a little bit more in advance, but still, I'm still writing it mostly live.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I have a slightly similar approach, but also a little bit different. So I also, whenever the idea strikes or based on the conversation that I had with someone, like looking for the trigger, whenever the trigger event happens, I also sit down and write the whole thing. If it's possible for me, if I have the time, I'll just do it. Many times I will also make the time for it. But in a lot of cases, when I'm just running or walking or in a casual situation where I might not be in a position to actually write that down, I'll just make a note of it. So and I'll just use something which is very easily accessible to me. So it's like a default app on my phone.
Okay.
And sometimes when I have the time again, I'll pick one of those topics and try to expand on that. But to me, it doesn't matter what time I'm doing that. It can also be in the middle of the night or in the morning as well. But I also try to make sure to post that on the time when most of the people are online. So scheduling is a great feature. I use that everywhere. So even though I might have created the content just a day in advance, but I'll always just schedule it so that I don't really have to worry about hitting that right time.
Yeah, I tend to not schedule too much stuff just because of the reactive and live nature of what I'm doing. Sometimes I will schedule a reply, though, just so that it's not a bombarding of tweets in your timeline from something. I think that's generally a problem with Twitter threads, is that in that I don't like how it's a wall of tweets in a timeline. If I were to change it, if I was the designer there, I would love to be able to just have the main tweet in the timeline and then the threads a separate view, but that's not my job. So let's not suggest feature requests at the moment. But yeah, I generally tend not to schedule things. I do have something scheduled this week, but that's just because it was an idea that I came up with at the same time as another one. And I didn't want to post too many times in the same day for the same reason of polluting the feed, really.
Nice. So for those who are interested in creating this kind of content pieces, let's try to reverse engineer one of the recent pieces that you have made. So I'm going to pull this thread over here. I'm sharing the screen with you. So I'm looking at this thread that you created. Recently, you were looking to upgrade your iCloud and you went through the process, and that is when your system's brain came into play, and it was very confused by the usage of the buttons. And then that's why you tried to do unsolicited analysis to collect all of these buttons and try to make sense of it. And I can see that this has gained some good traction. Twitter has this annoying views thing over here now. So we can also see the views, which is 60K, but let's forget about the views. I think the engagement is important. And by the look of it, it seems like it also got a decent engagement with about more than 400 likes and retweets and a lot of comments. Let's try to reverse engineer this. We won't go into the entire thread over here. But could you walk us through the process of how this came to be and how you actually created the content, how you wrote down the tweets, how you created the assets? Because it looks like you clearly created these images which have all of the a screenshot from that application, then you have nicely titled it, and then you have also used labels and annotations. So it's not something that is just written content. You have also done some work to make it visual, so people understand what you're talking about. Let's try to reverse engineer this.
Yeah, so that actually happened. I did go through the iCloud process, and it was a case where I immediately spotted something was wrong or something wasn't feeling too right in the process. So I didn't purchase. I went back in the flow and just went backwards and forwards and was thinking something's not right here. So I then just started taking screenshots of every step. And I thought I'm going to come back to this later once I've actually purchased this product, because I do want it. When I went back and pulled those screenshots into Figma, I thought there is problems here. There are problems in this flow. Well, I say problems, I'm being very dramatic. Problems from a designer's perspective, which is not the end of the world. And I thought, okay, well, this is probably an interesting exploration that I can do at some point. So this was back in December, and I didn't post it until January because it took longer than I thought to make these assets. A lot of the time I actually ended up having to recreate the things. So what I did was I thought, I'm going to post something about upgrading in iCloud. There's going to be a discussion about the buttons, which in itself is quite funny because it's not that important. But I think people love this stuff. How am I going to do that? Then what I did is pulled them in, and I'm going to now share my screen and show you the Figma file where I made it all. So yeah, firstly, you'll notice I haven't named any layers, and that's totally fine. So what have we got? We've got the top frame where you can see the asset that I did to present it. And then a smaller version because Twitter's compression, Twitter's uploading thing didn't allow me to do that. Then you'll see here, basically the tweets drafted. So each tweet, I wrote basically the experience in a thread like this. I wrote all the text that I thought I might need. Then went back to Twitter, checked that it was in the character limit, and then came back and edited it if I needed to. And that's basically all the content there. You can see all these tweets. And then I made assets for each tweet. So I knew that I needed to, at this point, these are the types of buttons that we had. And then this is what the asset ended up looking like. The asset came after the text, which I think is quite important. I think it's a bit similar to when you ask a musician if they write the lyrics or the music first. I write the lyrics first, and then I write the music afterwards. And then I went through each section, made the asset. This is quite a scrappy asset, but I did it like this anyway. And you can see, if I zoom in, that this is actually just a screenshot with a mask on it. So I've faded out the background, just highlighted the top one, and then given it a name. This is not really important, but I gave it a name anyway, a component name. If I go down, you can see I've done the exact same thing, screenshot. And these are actually, I think this might actually be a component that I made here. No, it's just an image, yeah. So image that has been cropped, and you can see how scrappy this is. If I reduce the border radius, you can see the background image coming through. So I don't think this is important, but because it gets the message across. So it's just a copy of this screenshot, cropped down, and then given that radius.
We have a term for this kind of work in Hindi. So we call it thukpatti. So thukpatti means, the literal translation would mean something to do with spitting and trying to stick it together. So you're not really using glue, but you're just spitting it and you're putting it together. And it's actually a very common thing because Indians are also always just looking to get the job done. Mm-hmm. It's not always about having it in the perfect of the ways. So if we also call it jugaad, we just try to put things together. As long as it works, it's great. And here, clearly, the purpose was to make it work. And I think it's an important method that needs to be highlighted.
Yeah, so you can see how scrappy this is. But again, I don't think that matters because it's the lyrics of the text that is important. The asset is just a side to that. So this is basically what I did for that thread. And then I made this asset actually at the end, which might be interesting. I made the first tweet asset after I'd made all the assets. That's because I knew what the end result was. So this was just pulling, again, screenshots together of all the different screenshots. And I think that is totally fine.
Yeah, how did you make sure that tweets that you're crafting were of the right length? Are you using some kind of plugin to keep a check on the character limit?
No, again, not that sophisticated. It's basically going to Twitter, creating a new tweet, pasting the text, editing the text, going back to Figma, pasting the text there. So a cross-reference between like actually going to create a tweet, writing it, editing it, copy-pasting back and forth between the tools. So I don't think we need to be that elaborate with our processes if, as you said before, it gets the job done. I could have spent a week on this. I could have recreated the screens. I could have found the UI kit of iOS components, pulled them in, aligned everything nicely, chosen some nice fonts and arrow components and all this sort of stuff. I just don't think it's that important. I think the message was important.
Yeah, and I also think that one disadvantage of that approach is that, if you don't do it then and there, you might also lose motivation and you might feel that it's not really that important because, as you rightly mentioned, uh, talking about buttons is interesting. It feels important in that moment, but when you look at it after some time, you'd be like, "Who am I kidding? These are just buttons. I don't really care much about it. I have a beautiful glass of wine in my hand, and I just want to enjoy that." So, energy also drains, and we underestimate the timestamp that the energy comes with. You're not going to be energized all the time. So it's important that when you have the energy to capitalize on that. There is this concept in cricket. I watch a lot of cricket and I try to draw a lot of parallels from cricket. It's a sport that I've grown watching, and I've also played it not on a international level, but just on a gully cricket level. But I try to draw a lot of parallels from that. And they also say in cricket that when you get hundreds, try to get daddy hundreds. When you get a big score, try to make it even bigger score because you're not going to get a start every day. So you can't really just be in the same set of mind all the time. When you have that, just complete the whole thing.
Yeah. And the do it now attitude is incredibly important for me. I would advise everybody else to think about it or consider it at least, because tomorrow never happens. You're always going to have something else to do tomorrow when you want to do this idea or concept. So maybe cut some corners, maybe sacrifice the visual polish that your designer brain wants you to do, produce the idea and push it out there, test it, iterate it. Posting a tweet is not committing to a novel. It's really not that big a deal. As long as your true message is coming through, push it out, see what people think.
Yeah. And I think pandemic was a great reminder of doing things now rather than waiting for it later. You might not know how the world around you changes. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to get too dark now. There's another interesting thread that you have written. This is slightly different in the nature, which is why I also want to discuss that. So this thread is about it's about naming the components which are not commonly known. And this is actually interesting in the way that it is not just a single thread, but it's a series of threads. So you came up with this concept of naming things is hard. So what would you call it? And this can be replicated for so many things. Whenever you come across a new component, you can literally make it a series of things. And it's also engaging because now you're asking people questions, you're proposing a question to them, and people can share their opinion. And then you also go a little bit deeper into this. You start giving examples, and I think you also suggest your opinion on this. So how did this came into be, and what is this about?
This is, again, just almost trivial in nature, but hit a sweet spot, because I found through my job that people find naming things incredibly difficult. And that's probably no surprise. Components in particular. So you'll notice this asset is incredibly scrappy. It's not very well polished. It's not very well designed, but it did the job. There's an arrow pointing towards something, and that's all we needed to know. So I found that people struggle to name things consistently and over time and basically forever. So I thought maybe there's a way where I can use this platform to help people name the things they're struggling with. This is a secondary attempt at this, though, because at Figma's Schema conference in 2021, a couple of my colleagues who were hosting that conference ran a game in a break, which was, what would you call this component? And people loved it. And I thought, this needs to have a life somewhere else. So I extended that onto Twitter, where at some point I was posting it every week. And as you can imagine, there's not that many components to do one every week forever. So I kind of slowed down a little bit. But I thought it might be useful for me to show you what that file looks like too.
Yeah.
And just run you through the process of how that happens. So this one is definitely it's 2:00. What am I going to post about today? Let me quickly make a component. I'll post it and see what people think. And you'll notice here as well that the file is incredibly messy. And again, I don't really care about that. It's totally fine. So you'll see in here, I've got my frames, unnamed, and here you can see this one is a, whatever it is called. I call it a toggle or something like that. But you'll see on the right-hand side, I've got the inspiration. And this is actually coming from a Figma mock-up that I proposed to the team for the auto layout toggles. This was something that I ultimately posted as a follow-up in the thread and said, would you change your mind if it looked like this? Because what I typically find is that people answer things based on what it looks like. And that's why I say that what it looks like doesn't matter. The scrappier it is, I actually find the easier it is to name because you're not paying attention to the fidelity of what it could be. Anyway, in this file, loads of different examples of these components just randomly set up. Sometimes I'm using components to test things out. Sometimes I'm not. But generally, it's just a big dump of all these ideas over time where I'm playing around with this concept. You can see this one here. Well, I'm even using a grid here. Who knew? But this has come from inspiration from the Lattice website. And I took this sort of concept, redesigned it with my own content to look like this, then asked people what they would call it. Again, examples, examples, examples. And you can see under this one, the exploration that I did after it. So I posted one of these. And then in the follow-up, I think I went through all the different examples of naming, context, how you might structure it, different presentation options, context from a content point of view, and just see if people would change their opinion on their option. Sometimes I like to trick people and change the answer slightly in the thread, but generally speaking, it's a brain dump of ideas in here. So I've got one going out tomorrow, which is this one as an example.
Oh, that's a nice little teaser. Do you have some kind of template or base components that you've created that you use to generally showcase this examples, or you're always starting from scratch?
The frame size, so I'm generally trying to keep things to a square, so 1080 by 1080, just because I find that it appears nicer. But generally, there's no format. It's just the containing frame size, and I'll design with inside that. I've typically always used Roboto Mono as the font, again, to try and remove that visual polish from it, to focus on the architecture rather than the design. And then try to make things accessible in color palette, generally. But there's no component list or anything like that. I have actually been asked a bunch of times after whether I'm setting these all up to ultimately release some mega component library. The answer is generally no. But over Christmas, I did start working on a UI kit. So maybe at some point, these lessons will be pushed into a UI kit for everybody to use.
Yeah, that's really lovely. Thanks a lot first for sharing the behind the scenes. I always love seeing the messy middle. Behind the scenes is much more interesting than the final product. I mean, once the final product has to excite you, only then you would care about looking at behind the scenes. But this is great. Let's try to bring it back to the original topic that we had. There would still be components or aspects of your past life as a individual contributor designer that you might miss, right? What are some of the things that you miss now that you do a different role, now that you play a different role?
My answer usually is I don't miss any of it. And that's almost being 100% truthful, but there's definitely things I do miss doing. And I'll tell you what I don't miss as well later. But my design career was mostly as a solo designer, tiny companies, 20, 30 people. So the access to information is very different right now. Figma is a 1,000 person company. As you can imagine, that's massively different. The levels, how you get information, how you get news, updates, all that sort of stuff is very different. But as a designer specifically, I do miss creating things. And that's probably one of the reasons I started this UI kit over the holidays, is to scratch that itch of component creation and management. I do still do freelance work, so I still do get access to creating designs for clients, for people. Working with different departments is also something, based on my experience of being like a cross-functional designer, I guess, is something that I used to really love. I used to love sitting down with the sales team and helping them build presentation decks, or helping a social media team build better social banners, or helping the marketing team write blog posts. I used to love doing all that stuff, which, as you can imagine, is now what I get to do as a job. So I kind of funneled all those things into what I now like. As a designer specifically, there is something really, really nice about thinking or seeing progress in a business, and seeing the work that you or your team are doing that contributes to the bottom line and contributes to revenue. The sort of business side of that job, I used to love. I used to love seeing sales go up, and I used to love seeing us hiring more people and building teams and establishing strong foundations. You'll probably notice that I'm not really talking about pixels very much, because I don't see the design job as just about the pixels. It's about all the other things that I've spoken about. So I miss the business side of the design, really, and seeing the idea and then ideating it and then being able to play with it, either in the browser or on your phone. That is a really satisfying experience. And I think that's probably why I'm still scratching that itch with the freelance work that I'm doing.
Yeah, but as a designer advocate, don't you get to spend a little more extra time on the business side of things, because you are in a lot of calls with the people from sales? You are seeing that the work that you're doing is also impacting sales, and when the sales happen, the numbers go up. So do you not get a lot of that visibility or a chance to work on the business side of things?
In a way, yeah. We do have a very transparent approach to finances. So that's really useful. So we do get to see numbers every quarter. And that's great to see your impact on the business more widely. I think it's just a different scale and different feeling when you are actually producing the designs that are impacting that decision. In a way, I am impacting it in a different way, and it's kind of like through the design. But I'm also seeing the impact on the people that I talk to. So when somebody who I've spoken to gets a job in the community, that is incredibly rewarding. Or when I speak to a design systems team who released a version of their libraries, that's amazing. That makes me feel almost the same kind of thrill that I would have got as a designer in a company seeing our revenue go up. It's different sides of a similar coin, I suppose. But yeah, it's you can't really put a price on designing something in Figma, the developer coding it, then seeing it live.
Yeah, it's quite a magical feeling, right?
Yeah, we're very privileged to be able to do that.
Yeah. And how do you think your role is going to evolve? So designer advocate, as we spoke about it earlier, it's not like an established role. Usually only the companies that have reached a certain product market fit, or they are established, they would then start hiring people in this role. And we obviously don't have career ladders, or things are not as established as a typical IC designer, manager designer role. So how do you think the designer advocate role is going to evolve?
So it might be surprising, but there are leveling charts that we have for advocacy, and all the advocates have the same job title. In fact, everybody at Figma basically has the same job title in their departments, but you get different levels within that job title. So we do have those leveling charts. We know what we need to do to get to the next level. But as you're right, it's probably not necessarily a transferable position to other companies. Firstly, because it would probably be a conflict of interest if I went to go and work at another design company as an advocate. Also, I just generally don't have that interest in other software as much as in other design software as much as I do as in Figma. So you're right in that respect. For the career trajectory, I think that basically what I have been doing over the past 2 years is building up an excellence in design systems consultancy. So whether that is a future path, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I've never been a consultant. I don't know. But you can see a natural path into that kind of thing, or educating at scale. One of my colleagues in the advocate team used to be a professor at a university of design, and that's educating. So there's a natural transferable route out or in from education. We have a bunch of people in our community team who used to work in universities too. So there's a back and forth that way. There's a back and forth in sort of a consultancy way, or other things. Design is always going to be there. I'm not necessarily the kind of person who who enjoys management. That's not necessarily always been my best set of skills or the best way to use my skills, really. So management, maybe not, but who knows? I've always had an idea or maybe a want to run my own business at some point. I don't know what that is yet, but I think that enough people have told me that I would be good at it to think that maybe I would be good at it.
Yeah. Is it irreversible in a way? Because so you already mentioned that you can go into different directions after the design advocate role. So maybe growing more into the education side of things and consultancy on design system, because you have developed an expertise around a certain aspect of design. But does this become irreversible in a way that you cannot go back to being an IC designer, or the people that would then be interviewing you would discard the experience that you gained as a design advocate because it's not directly an IC design role? Is that a risk element in that?
For sure. And that's where interviewing is important, and the selling of your experience, regardless of whether it's been hands-on design work or whether it's, I could go into an interview and say, I have advised 100 companies on how to design components. That sounds quite compelling to me. Obviously, there's not been the creation side of it, and it's whether that person in the interview would see that as a negative or a positive. But that's probably why subconsciously I'm still scratching the freelance itch and doing those little projects here and there just to keep close enough. But in the job itself, we do spend a lot of time designing. It's not for a product, it's for learning the features inside out. But in order for us to understand auto layout, components, libraries, component properties, all these sorts of things, you need to design with them. So I had a meeting today actually with some of the team where we're thinking about the next version of our demo assets, which we are going to build. So we're going to design a pseudo product using the features, using our design skills for the purposes of showing Figma's features, which in itself is kind of a twisted way of looking at how that all comes together. But that is still designing. There's obviously the user-centered part of design, which is not necessarily there. That's a different discussion, I think. But if it's on the hands-on pixel pushing skills, we're still actually doing it, just not on a real product.
Right. So for those who have already made the decision that they want to switch into design advocate role, how would you suggest that they go about it? Like, what does the path look like for them to apply for a design advocate role at companies like Figma or other companies? Because I imagine it might not be exactly the same as applying for a IC designer role or manager designer role. The interviewing practice could also be quite different. So could you give us an idea about some of the skills that would be required and how you would suggest that they go about this?
Yeah. Before I got this job and before I applied, people sent me the job and said, you should apply for this job. And that's the first time that's ever happened in my career where multiple people have recommended a job to me. Most of the time, a job has been something that I've needed to get rather than something that people have recommended to me. But that might be an aside. With that in mind, you need to be a designer. You need to have experience in design to then use that to advise other people. You need to be passionate about the product, understand it. You don't need to be a 10 out of 10 expert. I still don't know everything. That's totally fine. But you need to understand the product, how to apply it, what features are, all that sort of thing. You need to be interested in education and using the skills you have built in the past to teach other people. Not in a really formal way. We don't run lectures or seminars or anything like that, but through conversation, we educate people, which is the next point of conversation and being able to talk to people. You need to be naturally somebody who's interested in sitting in a room with, or virtual or in person, and discussing topics with designers on the same level as they are. And that would mean, and you're probably thinking, but how do you know what they're going to ask you? And the answer is you don't a lot of the time. So thinking on your feet is a really important skill, maybe the most important skill really in this one, because you don't know what's going to happen. So you need to be able to breathe, relax, think about the question, answer it in a time and in a succinct way. Then you really need to be capable or interested in creating things, creating stuff. So whether that is somebody who likes to write articles, or whether that is somebody who has started a podcast, or on a much smaller level, maybe you made a social media template file in the community, that is showing that you firstly believe in community, but secondly, that you can deliver and create something on a timeline. So mashing all those things together, you kind of get a picture of what an advocate could or should be. In saying that, our team there's I think 13, 14 people, and we are all very different. We all have different backgrounds, different interests, and we spend our time differently based off what we think is important. Some people spend a lot more time in the product with the product teams. Some people spend a lot more time in the community. Some people sit in the middle. Some people like me kind of stretch ourselves very thin across all the different things just because we get distracted very easily. And some of us are more artistic than others. Some of us are more functional and more operations based than others. And that's why the advocacy role in broad strokes you can describe, but really it's demonstrating that passion for those areas that I mentioned.
Right. Are you looking for any design advocates at this time?
We're looking in the US at the moment for another one, and I think we might be hiring again in Tokyo pretty soon.
Yeah, so for those who are interested in applying for this role, I would say Louis has laid out a path for you. You can try and do the things that Louis just mentioned, and I would say you have a decent chance.
I also wrote an article about it a while ago. I think the title is "So You Want to Be a Designer Advocate," and hopefully that helps you.
That's perfect. Louis, I think we can wrap up on that note. Thanks a lot for being here, and thanks a lot for the candid conversation. I think we are doing a lot of C's over here: consistent, creators, candid, conversations. I guess I can make that a logo. I can make that a motto of the series.
Yeah, that would be the 3 C's of content or something.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you very much.